In 1937, Margaret Frances Thomas moved in with Frank Walter Christie and gave birth to a little girl named Helen. Margaret rarely talked about her past, so her new husband was shocked to find that his wife had two other children from a previous relationship who'd been in foster care for years. Margaret just had to give them up because she had no means of caring for them, but this didn't mean that they were living a good life. They were severely neglected and were tired of the turbulence in their lives. Lately, things were better for Margaret though. She was now with Frank and had a stable job. So when she started talking about her past and her desire to reunite with her kids, Frank agreed to let them move in with them. It was almost 3 years after they had Helen, and Frank and Margaret both thought this would be a nice addition to their small family. So in 1940, Betty and Raymond finally reunite with their long-lost mom and they start living like a family at their house in Downey, California. But things change, and in April 1950, Frank asks Margaret to leave. Margaret moves out, but what she doesn't take with her are her three kids. A month goes by, and interestingly, the only child that lives to live with her mom is the youngest, Helen. After she moved out, Margaret rarely stayed in contact with her two kids, but she occasionally talked to them on the phone. One day, when she was on the phone with Betty, Betty said the weirdest thing. It took seconds for Margaret to figure out what she was saying. She couldn't quite register what she was hearing. She said Frank, quote, had things to do with her, end quote. Margaret kept asking more questions. She didn't understand, but Betty couldn't say more. What did she mean had things to do with her? What does that even mean? It can't be. It just can't be what she thought Betty meant. After all, Betty was only 20 and she was Margaret's daughter, for God's sake. So Margaret gets back in contact with her estranged husband to get to the bottom of things. Frank just twists her words and finally asks her to move back in. Was he playing her? Was he just trying to deflect her suspicions? But as a mom, she figures either way, she should be there with her family, her kids, Betty. So on June 15th, 1951, she finally moves back in with her family. At first, everything seemed normal. Normal interactions, normal daily life. Betty had even found a job as a secretary and had bought herself a car. Things were good. But on day 5, Margaret gets her paycheck and Frank unexpectedly starts telling her which bills she has to pay, and the whole thing gets out of hand. Suddenly, they're yelling at each other about money, about responsibilities, about the past, and Frank suddenly blurts out, quote, well, I'll tell you now, I have screwed her. I intend to screw her as long as she's in this house, end quote. Margaret falls quiet. I mean, what do you expect? She's shocked. Now it's Frank that's confirming her thoughts. But somehow, she still can't understand. I mean, this kind of thing is well beyond the realm of possibilities when you're confronted with it. But then Betty says something that shakes Margaret to the core. She says, quote, oh no, you won't, Daddy. You are not touching me another time, end quote. The whole thing is out there now. The most terrifying thing that Margaret had thought about incessantly and had tried so very hard to deny. It was true. This time it was the only explanation. Margaret was livid. She told Frank that they were leaving and he was never gonna touch any of them ever again. Frank didn't seem to care at first, but as the conversation went on and Frank caught up that they were all leaving him, he told Margaret that he'd kill Betty if she ever left the house, and if Margaret got in his way, he'd kill her too. 2 days went by and Frank wouldn't stop drinking or threatening to kill Margaret and Betty. Now, the family went on living together and Margaret and the children never moved out. But I don't think it was a very happy or tension-free environment. Now, this is what's mind-boggling to me besides the fact that they never left. For the life of me, I can't imagine why Margaret invited him to go square dancing the next day. If you have anything to say about this, please comment, but I have gone through this over and over and over again and can't figure it out. I understand that they might have stayed at the house because Frank was threatening their lives nonstop, but I can't understand why you'd want to hang out with someone who's raped your daughter and now is threatening your children's lives. Maybe she had a plan B, escaping or something? I don't know. But anyway, she does invite him, but he says that he has a phone call to make and it depends on the code whether he goes or not. He says that all four of them have to leave the house and wait outside till he's done with his phone call. But Margaret hears something that scares her even more than she already was. He was talking about buying a gun from someone. It's July 3rd and Frank is still going on talking about killing Margaret and Betty. He keeps saying that he was gonna make this one a real 4th of July and even went as far as saying that he was gonna kill Betty on the 4th of July. When Betty got home from work that night, Frank even told her that she didn't have much longer to live. I really don't understand the dynamics of this family, probably self-preservation had kicked in, but on the same night, Frank stayed up drinking, still threatening Margaret and Betty, and who do you think was sitting there listening to all this? Margaret. As he's going on and on about killing them, Helen gets out of bed and goes to the kitchen. When she comes back, she's hiding something behind her back. Frank notices this and keeps asking her what she's hiding, to which she finally responds, quote, "Well, Daddy, I have got a butcher knife. If you dare lay your hands on Betty, I'll cut your throat from ear to ear," end quote. Gutsy, right? Then again, Frank starts yelling at Margaret that she's the one who's influenced all the children against him. Really? Well, 4th of July comes and goes and all that happens is that both telephone wires are caught and we don't have to wonder who did it. But then comes July 5th, and Margaret and her two daughters Helen and Betty are planning to swim at Long Beach. So after dinner they go out to Bellflower to get a swimsuit for Helen. When they get back home, Margaret sits down to work in the dining room altering the swimsuit and the girls start doing the dishes in the kitchen. Then Margaret just starts telling Frank about their plans, at which point he gets up, goes to the bedroom, and returns to the kitchen. Then he pulls out a gun out of his shirt and says, quote, "You didn't think I had a gun, did you?" End quote. Seeing the gun, Margaret jumps in front of the gun and stands between Betty and Frank, knowing that she is the main target. Frank keeps the gun pointed at all three and orders them to move to the living room. Margaret starts pleading with Frank not to do anything drastic, to which he responds, quote, "Well, that son of a bitch there should be pleading for her life, not you," end quote. Helen, holding a knife, moves towards her dad but is told to back off or he'll shoot all of them. He then grabs Betty's car keys and purse and pushes her out the door. As Frank is leaving the house with Betty, he tells Margaret that if she calls the cops and he sees one cop driving anywhere around them, he was gonna shoot Betty on the spot. While Margaret is still pleading with him not to take Betty and just leave her alone, Frank tells her that she will drive him out 10 miles and he'll force her to watch him commit suicide. Then she'll return home. Margaret follows them to the gate, asking just to kiss Betty goodbye. But Frank, being the wild man that he was, says he'll shoot her if she steps through the gate. They get into Betty's light green Ford and drive away. Believing that Frank is just angry and will eventually calm down and come back with Betty, Margaret doesn't call the police for 2.5 hours. But it was just too late. 4 days go by and there is no sign of Betty or Frank. But they do find her Ford abandoned in an open field. The police had nothing else to go on. There was just no sign of either of them. No trace, no call, no nothing. On July 30th, Richard Hill was driving north on Highway 6 with his wife and children, and at some point they parked beside the road for the children to have some chocolate milk. After running up and down the hill for a while, the children run back to their father saying there is a dead man in the gully. Richard, who is doubting his children's story and chalks it all up to their imagination running wild, walks back to the gully and looks down. There was a dead body. He then rushes back to his car and drives away to find the phone. But then he spots a patrol car, grabs the officer, and takes him back to the body. The body was in a ravine about 15 feet from the top. The head was lying northwest and the right hand and arm were draped over a barrel. At the crime scene, there was found a silver cigarette lighter and a silver cigarette case with the initials FWK on the lighter. There was a pair of shoes lying near a bush and there were beads, but no gun. The body was in a state of decomposition. Betty Jean Hansen had been found, and the autopsy report indicated that the immediate cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. So, armed with the autopsy report, the police start taking another look at Betty's car which had been found earlier. The car had been recently washed, but they still found a reddish-brown stain. She'd been shot in the car. While the police were hunting down the fugitive, 20-year-old Betty Jean Hansen was laid to rest under the shade of an elm tree in Downey Cemetery. And as for karma, Frank Christie was arrested in Sterling, Colorado on July 25, 1951. This part of the case goes like any other messed up case you hear about. Frank immediately started making the self-serving statements that every sexual abuser makes, saying that the sexual relations were consensual. He stated, quote, "Betty devoted all her time to me and didn't go around with boys. She wanted to leave, but in such a manner that her mother wouldn't object," end quote, and that Margaret had been jealous of the attention he paid to Betty right from the start. When being interrogated, Frank denied everything, even to the point of denying that he'd shot Betty in the car, which the police had physical evidence of. He told the police that after he left the house with Betty, they stopped at a store to buy a bottle of whiskey, and then they drove to the top of the hill on Highway 6 because Betty was tired. They started walking slowly and talking about what they were going to do when Betty starts saying that she has no clothes and has to go back home to get some. He said that they were holding each other while she was trying to push towards the car and he was trying to hold her back when the gun dropped from his shirt to the ground, and he let go of her to pick up the gun. But when he straightens up, she grabs his hand and the gun goes off. Then she let go of him and rolled sideways down the hill. He then stated that he stood there for 3 minutes, then got on his hands and knees and looked down the hill and called out Betty's name, but there was nothing he could hear. He then got scared, got into her car and drove away. He then threw the gun from the window of the car and abandoned the car in an open field in Las Vegas, Nevada. Safe to say that the police bought none of this. They already had plenty of evidence indicating that Frank was obsessed with Betty to the point that he tattooed her name on his shoulder. The police also knew that he wouldn't let Betty date any guys, and it wasn't like she didn't want to date or go out with guys and just attend to him. He simply was too jealous to let her out of his sight. He'd been raping her for several years, and because Betty had started to work and had bought a car, Frank felt like she was slipping right through his fingers. These were Betty's way of showing her independence and regaining control of her own life and body, and this pissed him off. As Betty's control grew stronger, his grew weaker and weaker, and Frank, the sick person that he was, didn't like this. He even had 2 huge vicious dogs that were free to roam around in the yard because he didn't want anyone to think Betty was accessible. She was just his. And by the time anyone caught up on to all his weird behavior and the things he felt for and did to Betty, it was just too late. This 48-year-old guy was literally captivated by his stepdaughter and did everything he could to keep her all to himself. which is basically an extremely sick and twisted thing to do to anyone, let alone a 20-year-old girl who's your stepdaughter. Although he did his very best to avoid prosecution and denied everything, Frank Christie was sentenced to life in prison. Please leave any theories or comments you might have for us down below. We're really interested to know what you think about this case.